I used to be afraid of the dark. Monsters in the closet and boogeymans underneath the bed. I used to be scared of horror flicks that filled your head with the most unfathomable demonic creatures that anyone could think of, or psychopathic serial killers with no conscience, or storylines about being attacked in your dreams by a nightmare, so you stayed awake. But my Elm Street became the hospital bedside of my 10-year-old son. I never went on vacation before to distant lands, but I kept baggage tightly packed beneath my eyes and took my first class trip in what it really means to be a parent. And it was apparent that life would no longer matter to me unless my son's life was spared. See, I used to find fear in the simplest things, like never really being accepted in high school, or not wearing the latest clothes to impress my peers, or failing pop quizzes and exams. But my biggest test was to watch my child suffer in that hospital bed. And nothing in life or school that I've ever studied could have prepared me to give him answers that were equivalent to sounding intelligent. None of it made sense. About 2 years before we received his diagnosis, I watched him decline into a state that resembled nothing like the fears I had ever remotely experienced. I watched him be still instead of hyper. I watched him relinquish into the dark shadows that haunted me. I watched him grasp for the normalcy of being scared of boogeymen under beds and monsters in the closet. I watched him face a darkness that I really could never fathom. And it didn't involve psychopathic serial killers or dreams that turned out to be nightmares. I watched him. I watched my son. He spoke of death as if it were a long-lost friend that he just wanted to be reunited with. It was unsettling of how there was so much peace and understanding in him expressing his desire to leave his suffering for the sake of no one else suffering, viewing him suffer. I have never been more scared in my life than I have in those moments, and witnessing him make sense to just wanting the pain to end. I have never really known fear, at least not as much as I had thought. And I couldn't embrace death for him. But I was scared that I could comprehend while he knew it was an option. Our world changed. Nothing we knew previously carried as much importance anymore. His younger sister was just scared of her brother dying without him knowing that although she spent so much time getting on his nerves, that she loved him and was sorry that his nerves were going numb. My sister, their auntie, told me that my daughter told her in confidence that she hoped her big brother knows that she didn't mean to break any of his toys or bother him in the times that he just wanted to be alone. She was only 7, and the only monster in her closet at that time was the thought of her brother's funeral. My entire immediate family lived at his hospital bedside with forced smiles and prayers above whispers, and a distinct unspoken sense of unity to keep him focused on being happy, to plant hope in desolate ground, to grow new beginnings beyond revelations, to resist the fear of a new normalcy that matched a world that existed without him. Nothing else mattered. Nothing else seemed as scary anymore when you watch your 10-year-old child brave the circumstances of cancer. Dark closets became my comfort zones for me to cry in. Boogeymen became nurses and doctors. Monsters under the bed was chemotherapy being pushed through his tiny veins. Nightmares were dreams that I thought he'd never get the chance to have or fulfill. Psychopathic serial killers without a conscience were malignant cells that metastasized from being riddled through his central nervous system to the depths of his spine at stage 4, and the acceptance of his peers were reduced to being confined within the realms of his speech therapist, his physical therapist, his psychologist, and every other specialist that visit his bedside daily to ask him how he was doing. I cringed every single solitary time my 10-year-old son was questioned about how he was doing in a hospital bed that felt like millions of miles from a normal 10-year-old child's life. I cringed every time I watched him cry, begging me to take him home so that he could be around his family while he dies. I cringed while watching him fight to understand what he did to deserve this. And when he lost his voice because the tumor paralyzed one of his vocal cords, I cringed when he awoke from the surgery after the doctor put the trach in. I didn't cringe because of the hole in his throat or the medical apparatus that was placed in it. I cringed because the thought of never ever being able to hear my son's voice again became one of my new biggest fears. He had to scribble on a dry erase board for 6 months just to express his wants and needs. And I thought I was scared of all of those previous things, but fear no longer had a definition. No, the fears that I had before just paled in comparison to viewing my son put down under anesthesia more than 60 times and walking away praying that he would come back from the other side. Fear paled in comparison to thoughts on how he would survive on the other side of this when he's questioned by people that can't even begin to fully understand the weight behind the words he would struggle to use to articulate his pain and suffering. Fear paled in comparison to the moment when his hair began falling out and he just got so upset he began ripping the remaining tresses out with his fingers. Fear paled in comparison to the decline of when his thick 119-pound 10-year-old physical frame withered into 65 pounds at his lowest weight. I could literally pick my child up in my arms as if he were an infant again. And I wish that I could tuck him back into my womb again, away from a world that was crashing down all around him. I wish that all I had to do was tell him that this was all a figment of his imagination, that he could just go back to sleep after I checked under his bed and showed him that there were no monsters, turned the light on in his closet and kissed his forehead and whispered in his ear that boogeymen aren't real. But none of these things were areas that he was scared of and required comfort in. At 10 years old, my son discovered a life where fear was to not accept the probability or chance of him not making it through fighting stage 4 cancer. Death lingered around every corner that he could not avoid. He met death. He sat with him. He became well acquainted and decided that life was much better. I used to be afraid of the tiniest things, but fear no longer exists in our world.